night. So we know that originally her team filed this complaint back in December for alleged sexual harassment against Justin Baldoni on the set of It Ends With Us.
The court concluded that allowing the lawsuit against Wallace to proceed in New York would not meet those constitutional standards. In summary, the judge dismissed all claims against the Wallace defendants in the New York case, without prejudice, allowing for the possibility of a revised complaint but making clear that the current evidence was not enough. The ruling does not exonerate Wallace from the broader allegations. It simply says that if he is to be held accountable, it must be in a court that has legal authority over him based on his actions and connections. The judge also stated that the other parts of Lively's case in New York against other defendants would continue, suggesting that there was enough evidence for those claims to proceed separately from the Wallace.
Do not know the names of these women who she has this evidence, that she claims she has this evidence of, but we do know that they will testify and produce responsive documents in the discovery process.
Multi-forum case cannot be overstated, and every ruling like this one affects how the rest of the litigation may unfold, as this case draws to a pivotal moment with the New York court granting the motion to dismiss filed by Jed Wallace and his firm Street Relations. It is essential to reflect on what this ruling does and does not mean. The court did not decide whether Lively's underlying claims of retaliation, emotional distress, false light invasion of privacy, or civil conspiracy were true or false. It ruled strictly.
You always control what the internet is saying about you, what the headlines are saying about you. So how has that media attention impacted your brand, your businesses?
It's what Tina Fey says: if you're feeling good about yourself, just go online.
Institution Lively's legal team tried to argue that because her harm was felt in New York, and because some of the alleged co-conspirators may have acted from or within New York, all defendants should be pulled into that courtroom, but the judge rejected that reasoning. A court cannot assume authority over someone just because they know someone else who may have done something wrong in that state. The law demands more. It demands proof that the person being sued acted with knowledge of the state-level impact or directed the acts that occurred there. This threshold was not met. The ruling also reinforced a principle many may overlook. When public disputes turn legal, every defendant must be individually assessed. Their actions, their intent, their awareness, and their involvement must all be demonstrated specifically. This is especially important in conspiracy-based claims, which are by nature broad and often complex. Lively's attempt to link Wallace to a group of individuals she claims worked together to damage her name fell short, in part because she could not show that Wallace was aware of the details of the others' actions, especially as it pertained to New York. The ruling is a procedural victory for Wallace, not a declaration of innocence or guilt, and not a denial of Lively's broader allegations. If new evidence is discovered that connects Wallace directly to acts in or aimed at New York, Lively can amend her complaint and refile before the July 30th deadline given by the court. But she must do so with specificity, not speculation. The court also declined to order jurisdictional discovery, meaning Lively will not be allowed to search for jurisdictional proof unless she already has enough to warrant the search. This legal catch-22 protects defendants from being subjected to wide-ranging investigations unless plaintiffs can show a foundation for them from the start. It also signals that the court does not believe Lively has made even a minimal showing that Wallace was tied to New York. This legal standard is strict but intentional. It reflects the balance courts must maintain between a plaintiff's right to seek justice and a defendant's right not to be dragged into foreign courts based on weak or speculative links. From here, Lively has several legal paths she can pursue. She can amend her complaint against Wallace in New York if she finds stronger facts. She can continue her case against other defendants who are not dismissed. She can respond to Wallace's ongoing defamation lawsuit in Texas, where jurisdiction is not in dispute. And she may also pursue legal action in California, where many of the events are alleged to have occurred. But each venue will have its own rules, its own burdens of proof, and its own procedural traps. Lively's legal team must tread carefully, not just in crafting their narratives, but in matching each claim to the proper court. The story of this legal battle is far from over as Wallace and Lively prepare for further confrontation in Texas and possibly elsewhere. This case remains one of the most complex and high-profile legal entanglements involving a Hollywood figure in recent years, involving media manipulation, digital narratives, and multi-state jurisdiction. It brings to light how much effort it takes to hold people accountable in court, even when the court of public opinion has already picked sides. The legal system demands more than just loud voices. It demands evidence, precision, timing, and jurisdiction. The stakes are not just reputational but procedural, with motions being filed and responded to across multiple states, each one potentially changing the landscape for both sides. What also becomes evident is that this case is not just about one plaintiff and one defendant, it is about power influence. And the systems we use to resolve disputes in the digital age, it is about what happens when private retaliation becomes public scandal and when allegations spill over from film sets into courtrooms. Lively's claim centers on the belief that she was unfairly targeted for speaking out, and that a media campaign was organized to silence her. Wallace denies involvement and says he merely performed routine analysis work for clients, but the bigger legal questions are who knew what, who did what, and where did they do it? As we have seen, the answers to those questions have enormous consequences, not just for the outcomes of lawsuits, but for who gets sued where and when. This case also highlights the broader implications for creators, influencers, and media professionals who may find themselves drawn into legal firestorms based on third-party actions. It serves as a reminder to all that association alone is not enough for legal responsibility. Courts will demand that each person accused be shown to have acted knowingly and with intention to cause harm within a specific jurisdiction. The law is careful, methodical, and slow compared to online discourse, but that caution is deliberate. It protects both accusers and the accused from premature judgment and guarantees that facts, not feelings, guide the process. For now, Jed Wallace is out of the New York case, and unless Blake Lively produces stronger jurisdictional ties within the next few weeks, he may stay out for good. But the battle continues elsewhere in Texas, and perhaps in California. Each of those cases will require its own evidence, its own argument, its own ruling. What we know today is that in New York, the case against Wallace has ended, but the larger legal war involving these parties is far from over. In closing, this ruling is a cautionary tale for plaintiffs who seek to sue multiple defendants across state lines, and for anyone involved in high-stakes public conflicts with potential legal fallout. Jurisdiction is not just a formality. It is a gatekeeper that determines whether a case lives or dies. And as we have seen in the case of Blake Lively versus Jed Wallace, that gate can we now have firmly closed without the right complaint against Jed Wallace in the New York court. This is separate from the Texas lawsuit, which is still awaiting a decision on the motion to dismiss that Blake filed. This current ruling only pertains to New York. Remember, initially Blake did not name Wallace in her original filing, but after he sued her in Texas, she amended her complaint to include him. That led to debates about where this legal battle actually belongs. Before we get into the legal discussion, there has been some confusion around the subpoenas involving subscriber information. People seemed really alarmed by the idea that those subscribed to these channels could have their data requested. What they are actually seeking in the subpoenas is the information of the person who subscribed to a service. Like, for instance, if I subscribe to someone's channel, they are looking for my data, not the list of who subscribes to my channel. YouTube doesn't even have detailed info on subscribers to that extent. Still, I'll talk to the lawyers to confirm and won't be discussing that too much while this legal issue is ongoing. Now, let's focus on the ruling itself. Lively's amended complaint alleges for young
actress who was part of it, because she said how great the set life was and how wonderful an environment Baldoni had created.
I remember reading that too. Yeah, so we'll see.
Okay.
Slight invasion of privacy and civil conspiracy. The Wallace defendants responded with a motion to dismiss, citing lack of personal jurisdiction, improper venue, and failure to state a valid legal claim. The court ultimately granted the motion to dismiss due to lack of personal jurisdiction. Personal jurisdiction is specific to each defendant and ensures there's a proper legal connection between the defendant and the state where they are being sued. Lively's case against other defendants will still proceed in this court, but as for the Wallace defendants, they are based in Texas, and Lively has not provided enough proof that they did anything to make them legally accountable. In New York, most of the alleged negative press campaign happened outside New York. Any specific actions that did target New York were done by others, and there's no indication that the Wallace defendants were even aware of those acts. Wallace stated in his affidavit that he never met Blake Lively, never was on the film set, and doesn't even know Justin Baldoni. The court agreed and ruled that he cannot be forced to defend himself in New York. If Lively wants to pursue her claims against him, she must either refile somewhere else or amend her complaint with more specific jurisdictional allegations. Since the ruling is based purely on lack of jurisdiction, the court didn't even examine the rest of Wallace's legal arguments. Under Rule 12b2, the burden is on the plaintiff to prove that the court has jurisdiction, and in this case, Lively didn't meet that burden. Even though courts can consider affidavits and other materials beyond initial pleadings, they can't dismiss the plaintiff's claims based on the defendant's affidavits alone, unless there's been a proper hearing or discovery in the situation. Even if we assume all of Blake's allegations are true, they still do not give the court jurisdiction over Wallace. The court follows a two-step test to determine jurisdiction over a defendant who does not live in the state. In this case, Lively did not argue that Wallace or his firm had any regular business or residence in New York, nor did she prove that they took any acts inside New York that could connect them legally to the case. Wallace lives in Texas and his company Street Relations is based in California but operates out of Texas. There's nothing in the complaint to suggest they did any business in New York or committed any wrongful act. Their Lively tried to argue that even if the Wallace defendants didn't directly act in New York, they were part of a conspiracy where others did act in the state, and therefore their co-conspirators' actions should count as their own. This is known as conspiracy jurisdiction. It is a legal theory that says if a member of a conspiracy does something illegal in one state, all members of the conspiracy can be held accountable in that state. But to apply this, you must prove the out-of-state defendant knew about and benefited from what their co-conspirators did in the state. According to Lively, the co-conspirators like Melissa, Nathan, and others made calls, sent messages, or met people in New York to damage her reputation. She claimed that Wallace should be held liable because he was working with them and must have known what they were doing, but the court said no, she has not shown any proof that Wallace knew of or directed any actions in New York. Even though some alleged co-conspirators lived or worked in New York at times, there's no evidence of specific harmful actions they took there or that Wallace knew they were operating from that location. One co-conspirator allegedly threatened Lively at a film premiere in New York, saying he'd spend $100 million to ruin her life, but that's not enough. It's not clear that this was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy, or that Wallace even knew about it. The court emphasized that a threat made at a party, even if outrageous, is not the same as an act that furthers a conspiracy, especially when the statement wasn't recorded or verified and no connection to Wallace was established. Similarly, the court said that just because a co-conspirator lived in New York briefly doesn't mean anything unless they did something harmful from that location and unless the out-of-state co-conspirator knew about it. So the idea that Wallace can be held accountable in New York failed, because there's no evidence of any co-conspirator acting in New York on his behalf or with his knowledge. Now, to be clear, Lively did allege that some of her co-conspirators had communications with New York-based media outlets like the New York Post or New York Times, and possibly planted negative stories, but again, she didn't show that Wallace was aware of those efforts or directed them, even if he worked with those same people. There must be specific evidence he knew about their New York connections, and there just isn't. The court also said that even if Lively wanted to get more jurisdictional evidence now through discovery, that wouldn't help her case, because the deadline for discovery had already passed, and she failed to make a sufficient start in proving jurisdiction. So the judge granted the motion to dismiss the claims against the Wallace defendants without prejudice, meaning Blake can refile or amend her complaint by July 30th if she finds stronger evidence connecting Wallace to New York. Otherwise, her claims against him cannot continue in that state. Now, this ruling clarifies a key boundary in jurisdictional law, especially in high-profile defamation or conspiracy claims. You cannot just pull someone into a court in a different state unless you can show that they personally or knowingly participated in acts that had an effect in that state. In this case, the judge looked closely at whether the Wallace defendants took any actions in New York or knew that others were doing so on their behalf, and found that Lively failed to show either. So even though there was a broader alleged conspiracy involving media manipulation and reputational harm, the connection to New York was too weak to bring the Texas-based defendants into that courtroom. There is an interesting legal principle here called conspiracy jurisdiction, which has been used in the past to tie multiple defendants to a central location when their alleged joint activities impacted that location. But courts require more than just speculation or associations. They want specific factual allegations that show the defendant was part of the scheme and was aware of where the actions were taking place. In Blake's case, she had alleged that several co-conspirators acted through PR firms' digital campaigns and behind-the-scenes pressure tactics to discredit her and protect others involved in the film, but she could not show that Wallace, who was brought in after some of these things had already started, was aware of or directed anything that happened specifically in New York. The judge pointed out that much of the planning and conduct allegedly took place in California and Texas, and that Wallace worked from there even if others in the group lived in New York part-time. That alone doesn't bring Wallace under New York's jurisdiction. The judge also noted that conspiracy jurisdiction requires a clear line of control or direction that the out-of-state actor had over the in-state actor, or at least knowledge that their conduct was affecting the state. This was not met by simply showing that Wallace had general contact with others who did work in or near New York. The ruling also referenced the absence of any overt acts in New York linked directly to Wallace, or attributed to him with enough detail to justify keeping the case there. This included the infamous alleged statement at the film premiere, where someone allegedly threatened to ruin Lively's life while attending the event. The court said that while threats can be overt acts in some cases, they must further the conspiracy and show an intent to act, not just vent frustration or hyperbole without any evidence that Wallace was aware of or involved in that interaction. It couldn't be used to bring him into the case. Lively also alleged that some of her co-conspirators were in regular contact with New York-based journalists and media companies like the New York Post and the New York Times. She claimed that stories were placed in those outlets to harm her reputation. The court acknowledged that this could potentially be enough to establish jurisdiction over the people who actually made those contacts, but again, Wallace was not shown to have directed them or to have known where the media contacts were located, even though Wallace was alleged to have worked closely with PR teams and other strategic advisors. The judge said the mere fact that they collaborated on a general goal does not automatically create liability in New York without proof that Wallace specifically approved or knew about New York-based actions. The court also considered whether Lively should be allowed jurisdictional discovery to try to uncover more evidence, but denied it, saying that she had not made a strong enough start to justify it. The judge emphasized that she had her chance during the discovery phase and could still amend her complaint by July 30th if new facts come to light. Otherwise, her claims against Wallace in New York would be over. The court also mentioned that personal jurisdiction must satisfy not just state procedural rules but federal due process requirements, meaning it must be fair and reasonable to require someone to defend themselves in that state. Here, because Wallace had no office, no business, no activity, and no clear awareness of acts happening in New York, the judge found it would violate his constitutional rights to force him to defend himself there. The ruling also took a careful look at Wallace's affidavit, which stated that he only provided passive analysis of media environments and understood he was working for clients in California. Under the law, the court can consider such affidavits, but cannot use them to override the plaintiff's allegations unless the plaintiff has failed to present any facts suggesting otherwise. In this case, even if the court assumed everything Blake said was true, it still didn't establish jurisdiction over Wallace. This is important because courts generally want to avoid forcing people to travel to faraway states to defend lawsuits unless there is a clear and legal reason to do so. Lively's team had argued that Wallace collaborated with others who did have New York ties, but without proving his knowledge or control, those ties cannot be extended to him. The ruling makes it clear that even in complicated multi-state legal disputes, each defendant's specific actions and knowledge must be considered separately. You cannot just lump them together based on association or collaboration. Without detailed factual allegations, the court acknowledged that some of the other defendants might have valid jurisdictional connections to New York and said those parts of the case would move forward. This includes any defendant who communicated with media outlets or conducted business inside New York and where there is evidence they did so knowingly and intentionally. Wallace, however, was not one of those people, and so the court ruled that he should not be included in the New York portion of the case. The judge further noted that even if some of the other co-conspirators lived in New York or visited during filming, the conspiracy to damage Lively's reputation only allegedly began after filming was over, so any meetings during production were not relevant to the conspiracy claims. Lively had cited a meeting in New York between Justin Baldoni and another co-defendant where they discussed allegations of harassment, but the court said that meeting happened before any of the alleged retaliation or smear campaign began. Therefore, it couldn't be counted as part of the conspiracy. Wallace was also not involved in that meeting and reportedly was not yet hired. The timeline matters here because for jurisdiction purposes you have to show the defendant was involved at the time the alleged events occurred, not just connected later. Once the campaign had evolved again, the judge left open the door for Lively to amend her complaint with stronger jurisdictional facts if she has them, but for now the dismissal was without prejudice, meaning she can try again if new evidence arises. This ruling is significant not just for this case, but for others involving online reputational harm and coordinated campaigns across states. It shows how difficult it can be to hold someone accountable in a state where they don't live, unless you have very specific evidence about their knowledge and actions in that state. Many online campaigns involve people working from different locations and coordinating virtually, but unless you can prove that someone targeted a specific state or knew others were doing so, it will be hard to make them defend themselves there. The court ruling also outlines that simply working with others who commit tortious acts in a state like New York is not enough to pull every co-conspirator into that jurisdiction unless you can prove that the person you are suing had actual knowledge that their collaborators were doing something harmful. Within that specific state, the judge found that Wallace and his company had no such knowledge or involvement in New York-based acts. According to the ruling, Wallace resides in Texas. His firm is incorporated in California and its principal business operations also occur in Texas. Lively had not alleged that Wallace or his firm ever transacted business in New York, committed wrongful acts in the state, or directed others to act in New York on his behalf. Without such evidence, the court ruled that it could not exercise personal jurisdiction over him. The amended complaint did refer to some New York media contacts, including Sarah Nathan, who is reportedly the sister of Melissa Nathan, one of the alleged co-conspirators. These media communications were described as part of a campaign to shape coverage and push negative stories about Lively, while boosting Baldoni. However, the judge ruled that Lively failed to demonstrate that Wallace had any knowledge of these contacts or participated in them. Therefore, the media outreach within New York could not be attributed to Wallace. For jurisdictional purposes, the court acknowledged that under certain circumstances, one conspirator's contact with a foreign state can be imputed to others in a conspiracy, but only if the out-of-state conspirator is shown to be aware of those acts or had some degree of control or direction over them. In this case, the court ruled that Lively had failed to meet that standard. Lively had also argued that one of the co-conspirators made threats against her at the premiere of the film in New York City, allegedly stating that he was prepared to spend $100 million to ruin her life. The judge ruled that while threatening language might, in some cases, qualify as an overt act in furtherance of a conspiracy, there were no allegations here to suggest that the alleged statement was intended to further the conspiracy or that Wallace had any awareness of the statement or involvement with the individual who made it. The judge emphasized that the context and purpose of such a statement must be evaluated carefully, and in this case, the court could not infer that the statement advanced the conspiracy or had any connection to Wallace. The judge went on to say that even if Lively's allegations about negative press and media influence were credible, and even if they harmed her, the court ruled that Wallace, who was accused of working closely with PR teams and other strategic advisors, did not automatically create liability in New York without proof that he specifically approved or knew about New York-based actions. The judge also considered whether Lively should be allowed jurisdictional discovery to try to uncover more evidence, but denied it, stating that she had not made a strong enough start to justify it. The judge emphasized that she had her chance during the discovery phase and could still amend her complaint by July 30th if new facts come to light. Otherwise, her claims against Wallace in New York would be over. The court also noted that personal jurisdiction must satisfy not just state procedural rules, but federal due process requirements, meaning it must be fair and reasonable to require someone to defend themselves in that state. Wallace had no office, business activity, or clear awareness of acts happening in New York. The court acknowledged that some other defendants might have valid jurisdictional connections to New York and said those parts of the case would move forward. However, Wallace was not one of those people and should not be included in the New York portion of the case. The ruling is significant for others involving online reputational harm and coordinated campaigns across states. It shows how difficult it can be to hold someone accountable in a state where they don't live unless you have very specific evidence about their knowledge and actions in that state. The court also outlined that simply working with others who commit tortious acts in a state like New York is not enough to pull every co-conspirator into that jurisdiction unless you can prove that the person you are suing had actual knowledge that their collaborators were doing something harmful within that specific state. This video covers legal allegations in a news context. All claims are from official filings and no guilt is implied until proven in court. Please keep all discussions respectful. Allegations are not facts until proven in court.